So, Lucas Paqueta's spot-fixing trial has finally come to an end, but the wait goes on to find out if the Brazilian midfielder will ever be allowed to play again.
Charged with 4 counts of being deliberately booked to influence betting markets, the FA have sought a life ban for him.
Today, we're going to be joined in the studio by Moses Swaibu, once Scholar of the Year at Crystal Palace. He was sentenced to 16 months for match-fixing while he was playing at non-league Bromley.
So he'll explain to us how sophisticated this kind of corruption is in football 15 years later.
And we'll look at how sport more broadly is struggling to keep up in the fight against match-fixing.
Welcome to the Sports Agents.
Hello, Mark.
Hi, Gabby. How are you? Good weekend?
Good, yeah. I enjoyed watching Wales-Belgium or Belgium-Wales with you last night.
Yes, yeah. We both kind of stumbled across it on BBC. I mean, you were obviously looking for it anyhow.
I was actively looking, but I had no idea that it was being shown on BBC One.
No, and there it was on BBC One. So there was ages, and it was great as well.
In the past, I've sometimes watched a Wales match on S4C, but had 5 live commentary because I don't speak Welsh. Right. 5 live commentary over the top of it. But last night we were able to enjoy it with English commentary, obviously, that I could understand, and it ended up being quite a thrilling game, didn't it?
It did. Wales coming back from 3 down and then losing 4-3 at the end. So that was and actually, to be fair to Craig Bellamy, he said how proud he was of his players as well. So whilst the defeat is obviously not what Wales expected, the way they came back in the second half was great.
Yeah, it was. Now we've got a bit of oval ball chat, but just before we get into Hull KR, I was slightly concerned that we were going to jinx Sale at the end of the season. They weren't going to make it into the playoffs. No. I don't feel we can be responsible, though, for their defeat to Leicester at the weekend. It was a great effort, but I think Leicester probably were the better side on the day.
It's just, it's from a Sale perspective, it's gutting and heart-wrenching. I suppose there is that element as well that if you're a sporting purist, you end up with the 2 teams who finished in the top 2 in the league taking on each other in the final. So they had home advantage, did Leicester, because they finished second.
It makes such a difference, doesn't it? That
does
home
make
advantage.
such a difference. I didn't see the Sale game because I was at Wembley for Hull KR winning the Challenge Cup for the first time in 45 years, and that went down to the wire as well, with them scoring the winning try in the last couple of minutes that had to be converted by Mikey Lewis. But that was a great afternoon for them. They'd lost the final a couple of years ago on Golden Point, so they went through the ringer, did the Hull KR fans, but it was a special afternoon for them. And Wigan beat St Helens in the Women's Challenge Cup final, so St Helens' run of 4 straight titles comes to an end, and Wigan, with Dennis Betts as their head coach, that's a massive win. It's great for women's rugby league because it means that the depth is starting to increase.
And another rugby league story, they finally have their first knight. Billy Boston is going to receive his knighthood this week.
He's 90, is Billy Boston. He's one of the greats of the game. Played for Wigan and Great Britain in the 50s and 60s.
And a trailblazer in terms of being one of the first black players.
Yeah,
came from South Wales.
Absolutely. So it has done so much, universally admired, I think I can say, within the sport, and now rugby league's first ever night, which is also astonishing, really, and could give you an insight into how these things work.
We might talk a bit more about that on the podcast soon. So to today's topic, which will dominate the rest of this podcast, because Lucas Paqueta's spot fixing trial is over. The verdict is yet to come. Just a reminder that the West Ham and Brazil midfielder could get a life ban if it's proved that he did fix matches. He was charged by the FA with 4 counts of being deliberately booked to influence betting markets. He has denied all wrongdoing. It has clearly affected him, and West Ham have talked about his mental state and fragility over the 2 years.
2 years, Gabby. 2 years. I mean, I suppose it's easy for us to sit here and go, why has this taken 2 years? But that is a very long time for somebody to be under this kind of pressure, isn't it?
Oh, it feels extraordinary that he's actually managed to play on. You know what it's like yourself in life when you've got things hanging over you and you don't feel like you can think clearly. Imagine going out and having to perform at the highest level. Maybe football was the 90 minutes was a release, but the rest of his life must have been absolutely horrendous to deal with this, whichever way it goes.
And he's the individual who's carrying this at the moment, charged by the FA, as Gabby said, with 4 counts of being deliberately booked to influence those betting markets. But obviously, the picture is wider than that. It's much more than just the individual that has been charged. And in a little while, Moses Swaibu will join us, who in his career was mainly involved in spot fixing, which is exactly the kind of thing that Lucas Paqueta has been accused of. But his insight is absolutely fascinating.
And it's not something that is confined to lower leagues of English football. This is a $1 trillion industry, the betting market on football matches, legal and illegal. And there is an inference that there is a lot of organised crime that is behind it, money laundering. There's so much that's going on, movement of money around the world, and obviously other sports, and as the conversation will unfold with Moses, increasingly the growing market of women's sport as well.
So that's all on the way. You can catch up with all episodes of The Sports Agents on Global Player or wherever you get your podcasts. Hit subscribe or follow, and don't forget to rate and review.
After the break, Moses Swaibu, a former footballer sentenced to 16 months in prison for match fixing, will join us in the studio for an insight into how that happened and how it all really works.
Moses, we have so much to talk to you about, but before we get into all of your experiences, do you think it's important to start with to make the difference between match fixing and spot fixing?
Yeah, so match fixing is influencing the score or scoreline, an outcome of a specific match and moment. Spot fixing is usually built around yellow and red cards. You'll find on different types of markets across the world, especially on Asian handicaps, you may have yellow and red cards to influence the outcomes of specific moments on the pitch. So to give you a better understanding, if I get booked in the first 5 minutes and I'm a centre-back, that may influence some of the actions that I may take next time. Match fixing is your worst case scenario, where spot fixing is a bit more subtle.
Match fixing is presumably, if we're talking football, match fixing is hard to orchestrate. Is it?
It depends which way you're looking at it.
If you were to match fix, how many people would you need involved?
To be honest, you can fix a game on your own. It depends on A, your position, and B, the level of influence you may have on a team.
Is a defender in a better place?
Yes, a goalkeeper, defenders in a better place. Anywhere that's deep lined, depending on how your team's set up or depending on the strategic movement of how players operate.
Can we go back a little bit? And just because I think we're going to talk about what you're doing now, but I think it's important to talk about how you got into this and where you were in your life, because you looked at one point like you had the world at your feet. You'd be awarded the Scholar of the Year at Crystal Palace, and I think Vice Chairman's Award as well. You were clearly one of the outstanding talents of your generation, your cohort at Crystal Palace. And then a series of events meant it didn't quite go your way there, and you found yourself lower down the leagues, and you realised you needed to kind of work at it. But you still wanted to be a professional footballer, and you talked a lot about how being a professional footballer was going to keep you away from some of life's vices.
Yeah.
So explain a little bit about that.
Yeah, so to give you context, I'm 36 now. I grew up in the early 2000s in South East London. So I'm coming from the generation where social media clearly wasn't where it is today. So in a very much old school way, a lot of our community, I'll say, engagements were you physically had to go and meet your friends, etc. So probably I'll say between South East London, so Croydon, where my father lived, and Bermondsey, where my mother lived, I was probably the only kid at that time travelling to and from school, probably from around 9 years old. So I already knew I was quite different from everybody else, and luckily for me, I had a manager who got me into football called Andy Brogan. So what I saw in Andy and his family dynamics was a very much fully functioning, bigger, wider family, not only in football, but in life and society as our adolescence and our childhood are shaping. Also, I grew up with a lot of friends that went the right and wrong way. Earlier on in my early development, I'll say, not a lot of people knew what my family situation was in regards to how my dad had treated me, different elements of grooming and what that looks like that wasn't physical, an abusive stepmother that lived in my house, a dad that worked God knows what time in the mornings and evenings. So I was exposed to quite a lot of things I shouldn't have been exposed to, whether that was drugs, violence, or basically people doing the wrong things.
Mm-hmm.
Football always kept me on a straight and narrow. So whilst I very much had a difficult upbringing, I also had a game that I loved without realising where that's going to go. So it wasn't until probably the last school year, so the last week of year 11, I was picked up by Crystal Palace in a trial game. Played in a trial game, done extremely well, luckily for me, which was rare at the time. Bob Dowie, who was sporting director, had watched that game. As I went into my trial at Crystal Palace, he approached me and was like, "Oh, well done, we want you to do the 6-week trial, etc." And a lot of the Palace players went and had amazing careers. That was really the foundation of what Palace's academy was.
Mm-hmm.
So just to paint a picture, South London had this very much raw energy from kids that not only looked like myself, but everyone's coming from the same place. The club weren't really aware of what I was going through at home. We just walked in and played football. And more importantly, I got into Palace at 16 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So I was the last person to be signed without having that academy journey. So I'd gone from watching them to now being on the pitch with them. So I'll say my life changed in respects to me living my dream, but a lot of the issues I had, I've never actually spoken to anyone, Gabby.
Mm.
So when I went into Palace and I've won all of these awards, even though it was a surreal feeling, I had one extreme being at the highest version and height of myself,
Mm-hmm.
but the biggest come down was what was happening off the pitch. So Neil Warnock released me. I went into Bromley, and naively, I must have said to my friend, "How do you get another club?" He was like, "Why don't we just ring every Football League club?" So between 2009 to 2011.
This is what I'm sorry to interrupt you, but this chap, as I found amazing when I was hearing your story, because we learn now that maybe it's in response to what happened to you, but Palace have kind of been lauded for their aftercare, if you like, for players who don't make it. They've been praised for this kind of 18 to 21 year period of helping them get them out to other clubs. But then there was literally, it was like, bye-bye.
You were on your own.
Thank you very much. Nobody said, look, we've had a word with Charlton, or we've spoken to Gillingham, or, you know.
Yeah, but no one really sees football outside of the 1%, if that makes sense. And I think if you really want to be analytical and identify in the last 20 years, the amount of players that have left the game and severely been affected, whether that's mental health or suicide, and again, because of social media, where we are in society, those changing rooms and places where we played at kids have never really been safe. So I'll give you a perfect example. Imagine I live in Tottenham, I've been scouted for Palace, and I'm taking a bus or train to and from North London to South East London. How many journeys and people am I interacting with being a 15-year-old teenager with no mum and dad present, an uncle who takes me to football and no real foundation? Bearing in mind, London's a dangerous place. So by the time I get to the club, who's saying hello, who's saying goodbye? We're going out on a training pitch. So you're dealing with probably some of the toughest children in that society that are using football as a hope to get out. And I'm mirroring my experience on what's happening now with what the club and clubs are trying to do in regards to education. However, there's still an underbelly within the sport no one's really aware of, which is where I've left, gone to Bromley, gone to Lincoln, never moved to the north of England. One thing I did at Lincoln was use all of the development that I learnt in 2 years and almost reset again. However, South London never really left me in regards to the friends I had over there or being introduced to match fixing by a former teammate who played in the Premier League. I was 19 at the time, he was in his 30s, and I didn't actually know what corruption or match fixing was.
So this was where were you when this first conversation happened, and what did he do? Sidle up to you and ask if you were interested?
Again, it's how do I describe it? If you've never been groomed before, this form of grooming was very much in a friendly, kind, almost big brother period. You know, part of coming from the streets is all you want to do is feel safe. And a lot of young boys don't have that confidence because a lot of ego and testosterone revolves around people and parents and guardians not really speaking to them. So going into football where you have the first team manager and coaches and people you aspire to safeguard and look after you, there's no difference in what that teammate was to me at the time. He's a captain, the most decorated player. Our gaffer at the time was Chris Sutton and Ian Pearce, who played in the Premier League. So
this is while you're at Lincoln.
This is while I was at Lincoln. I think I was around 20 years old. So going into the hotel room when we had Northampton and sitting on the bed with two of my other teammates, it was ironic. The players from London were present in that meeting on behalf of what the captain had said at the time.
Similar backgrounds to you?
Similar backgrounds, but more importantly, I didn't realise the severity of what was being asked. All we're told is, if you lose tomorrow, you're going to get 60 grand. So whilst I looked at my teammate and we're bouncing on the bed and looking around, I knew it wasn't right, just to give you context. So again, it comes back to going the right way and the wrong way.
But you couldn't walk away at this point?
Were you helpless? Yeah.
You know what? We had a game. So there wasn't any real time to think. Luckily for all of us, everyone was on the bench. And that was very rare because everyone had started up until that point. The money was even in the change room. And Gaffer may or may not remember when he called out that team sheet, it was a breath of fresh air hearing everyone's on the bench. So as the result didn't come in, following day, we've gone back to Lincoln's training ground. The captain's given the match fixer the money back and he said, don't say anything.
So the bit I couldn't understand was why the cash was already there. Was that part of the grooming to entice you in?
The cash was brought to the hotel.
But why did they give you the cash up front?
I think it was almost inducement because one thing he said was, who wants to sleep with the money? And obviously one of my teammates was like, let me take 60 grand to my room and actually sleep with the money. See how you feel in the morning. But before all of this, I'd had, and this isn't excuses, this is just context, I was actually living with a prominent drug dealer who'd come up from London. Part of me going to Lincoln, the club didn't provide any accommodation. I've got a train ticket. He said, come and stay with me. I've stayed with him. He's put me up for a week. I was signed within 2 weeks. Didn't tell Bromley. Peter Jackson at the time absolutely loved me. When I signed, I became captain and I was literally on my way. The difference with that, when I signed my contract, I told him to come and live with me. So I knew what he was doing, but he kept that away from anything related to football. But then because of that, it later on affected not only my relationship with the club, but this is one of the reasons why the grooming element came in, because my captain was aware of this.
So it wasn't a wise move living with him?
It wasn't, of course, it wasn't a wise move. But again, when you come from where I've come from, number one, I'm not going to tell a stitch on anyone. And number two, in my mind, it's not affecting my football. If anything, it's doing the opposite, you know?
And that kind of answers the question that lots of people will probably be wanting to ask, listening to this at this precise moment, is there was a group of you, young players, who had heard the captain say this and the money. Why didn't you say something to someone? But that comes back to background and upbringing and not being a grass. Does it?
To be honest, I'll put you in my shoes, and for your audience, picture you've played less than 10 games, or you played around 10 games. The first team captain is the one that has brought you this. At that time, there wasn't any education or PFA or no one from the FA that came in and said, hey, be aware of your rules, right? In that moment, we knew it was wrong, so we said no. However, that wasn't actually part of the problem. The problem, and I found this out later, was we had a player who was addicted to betting and gambling, and he was the only international. So reading between the lines of where I've come from and people's behaviour, I quickly realised the problem wasn't what was said to us. The problem is he's facing some real life issues. Yeah. And those real life issues are being inherited by us and the people. And in a groom-like way, he's transferring that to me. And after I leave Lincoln, drop down the leagues, go to a club, underpaid, half check, half cash, having a daughter, best friend being killed in London, and a lot of what was happening off the pitch, friends are going in and out of prison. I never had no guidance and no structure, both in and out of football.
And what I got a sense of hearing your story on the BBC Sounds documentary was that actually it wasn't like you were getting a massive adrenaline rush from this. You didn't seem that scared about it. Did it seem low risk while you were doing it? Is I suppose what I got a sense of.
The real change actually came from the first game. What happened and the money that was involved wasn't actually
the first game. Sorry, Mazzy, the first game that you yourself fixed, or that first game that your captain had to hand the money back over?
No, so there was 2 occasions in between Lincoln where we said no. There's probably 6 to 9 months in hindsight.
Yeah.
So I've dropped down into non-league, gone to Bromley.
Bromley, yeah.
Teammates come up to me and was like, "Hey, there's a new set of match fixers." No one believed him. I'm like, "That happened at Lincoln, etc." We've gone to Mayfair to meet the match fixers. They've given us money, told us very specific from the beginning what this looks like. First question I asked was, "Are people arrested and who's been to jail?" They said no one. A lot of where the operational side of where match fixing actually works, my version of where I've seen criminals, these people are not only highly organised, they don't look like anything you can imagine because they just blend into society.
Let's get into that a little bit because the boss in that particular scenario didn't speak English. There was a translator there with you. This felt like this is organised crime. This is happening kind of behind the veneer of betting, isn't it? And it's $1 trillion business. You're now in an underworld of organised crime. Did this now feel very kind of normal to you, the operation of it and how it was happening? Because this is very different to what happened to you.
I think
at Lincoln.
Part of addiction comes from it became so normal. It was like we're literally waking up and eating breakfast every day, if I'm going to be brutally honest with you. It was so normalised because of what was not only happening on the pitch and with the club, half check, half cash, you may get paid, you may not get paid. Every single action was dictated by what was either happening on the pitch or off the pitch. And I mean that where we'd started off with 1 team, then 2 teams, then 3 teams, and probably a quarter through the season, he'd managed to have control over half of the league at that moment in time.
The big boss.
Yeah, the big, the main figure for the syndicate. Within that, I quickly realised you don't need 1 player to fix. Well, you don't need 5 players. You need 1 player. How do you now go to players and offer them what it was, which was bribes? So again, studying through the criminal organisation what syndicates look like. They had casinos, betting companies. This is 2010. A lot of where they were ahead of the curve. Every single day where games weren't fixed, someone else was fixing. They were leveraging their bets and placing them on other sports. Data back then wasn't what it is today because they had people in the stands writing down absolutely everything on where players are. More importantly, law enforcement weren't aware of what we were doing and what was happening because it didn't cross their jurisdiction. So towards the end, it came about through a daily Telegraph investigation. The match fixers who were fundamentally part of the original fix at Bromley, it was moved over by a Singaporean syndicate, and this is how ultimately everybody got tied into a conspiracy. Yeah.
Were you said he had control of half the league. Are you aware then when you go onto the pitch of which teams might also be involved in this, or which players on which opposing teams might be involved in this? Or are you all unaware of each other?
You know, it's really strange. You go from being the main man and thinking you're the main person, then the games where there's no live markets, you're playing a normal game and you hear things. And as I mentioned with match fixing, it's not always about losing. You can win, you can lose.
Hear things
you
on
can
the
draw.
pitch even?
Yeah, from players.
Like what kind of things?
Things like go left, go right, but it's from the opposite team. So I'm a centre back, I'm marking a striker. The striker's telling the defender what to do and where to go. Stand here, go and do this. And I'm thinking, well, I know what's going on because I know the lingo of how these things work. I know before every game who looks in a stand and where people are situated. So signals are very much dictated, but I'm not aware of that. And when I realised the size and scale of where this was growing, It's probably towards the end where I stopped match fixing and I retired from football. Then a month later, we were arrested under the conspiracy.
Give us an example of something you did in a game that was beneficial to you financially and altered the course of a game.
You know what? To answer that question in a more robust way, more things were done off the pitch. If I go back to what organised crime is, I was very much at the epicenter of figuring out who does what and where that goes, and earning considerable amounts of money from dealing with the organisation internally.
Right.
So from the first fix, I became a centre point simply because of how well that game went and the liquidity that was in the market. What I quickly realised from my own
What did you do in that game then? When they say that game went well for us as a syndicate, what had you done?
So 2-0 before the first half, a player who wasn't on the fix in the podcast, I call him Braveheart, he was giving away a penalty. When you're actually going through the motions, a lot of things actually go the opposite way. So you'll find from match reports and videos and what actually happens, players who claim they're going to do something usually have out-of-body experiences because they're not criminals. So it wasn't until the 44th minute a player who was in on the fix actually grabbed the ball in an area. Penalty comes in, 2-0. Fixers come in. So the match fixers who sent people to watch the game noticed and identified who was trying and who wasn't. So whereas the players were meant to receive the money, they gave me all the money and said, you're going to take over.
Because the players who were with you in that group, they deemed to not have tried.
They deemed to not have tried. So what I quickly realised from the first fix, the outcomes of what happened, people on the pitch are just playing normal, but because of the level, they're not as good as people who've come from the pro game or the semi-professional players. So mistakes at that level happen literally every moment of every game. So for match fixers, perfect because you could almost pinpoint minutes and areas if you look at the Asian handicap on where unders and overs and line movements can be made, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Excuse me for the stupidity of this bit. Isn't somebody grabbing the ball to give a penalty away kind of obvious?
Yeah, it's blatant, but if you look at steps 6 and 7, how many people were actually at that game? There's no TV. You rarely see fans at that moment getting their phones out.
But the peer pressure, because I understand what you're doing now is very much steeped in education and trying to kind of alert more people to what's going on and to avoid the route that you took. But peer pressure is the thing that changes most cultural behaviours, isn't it, ultimately? And it's that feeling that you're in a team, you don't want to lose, this is your journey together. So when somebody does something, as Mark points out there, that's so blatant, does the rest of the team not come down on them?
I'll give you an example. Even in the Premier League, mistakes happen. Obviously not as severe as that, but defender gets the ball. Let's just say it's Arsenal and Saliba. He gives a short back pass, someone goes and scores. First thing people are going to be like, it's rigged, it's fixed. If you look at lower down, and again, to expand your question, the problem actually isn't players handling the ball and the culture. The problem on a global scale with $1 trillion market, in certain countries and certain teams and leagues and owners and coaches, the players are actually at the bottom of the barrel. Players are having guns and families kidnapped because of organised crime on an international level.
So your answer is no, there's no peer pressure there.
There isn't any peer pressure. It's literally, in certain circumstances, life or death. So if you look at South America and areas in Africa and Eastern Europe, the root cause of this spans a network of invisible ghosts, because now you're chasing where digital currency goes, cryptocurrency goes. Their involvement isn't physical no more. The war's online. And within understanding the betting routes and the legal side of where gambling is, fueling into that addiction whilst players know they can't bet. But if you're earning, let's say, £1 million, for example, you can easily go to your friend and say, hey, can you set up a betting account? That betting account is unregulated. That betting account pays you. That betting account's linked to organised crime. The moment you lose, you're almost induced into what that area of organised crime is without actually realising it. So a lot of the cases we're seeing now in the Premier League or
right
in the
now,
world, right now.
Your story is 11 years old, right? So
yes,
how
15,
is this,
yeah.
How's it evolved?
It's evolved, again, the way the internet's gone, technology, A lot of where 15 years ago in 2010, the match fixers knew where betting sponsorship lies. When I came out of prison and sat down with the FA, the moment I knew there was live betting markets for under 18s and 23s game, that was really the change in where I knew everything else is going to go. If you're sponsored by a betting company that's unregulated with no due diligence, it's usually linked to some form of organised crime with 100 subsidiaries and people posing as actors to be CEOs and owners. So where betting went and exploded, a lot of the problems internally with athletes and players, they simply don't know the rules because they aren't really governed. Even in the UK, there isn't a law around match fixing. We were tried for conspiracy to commit bribery, so the actual perpetrators have never been found or, been penalised.
There's no actual charge of match fixing.
No, there isn't a law.
That's incredible.
That's in the UK, by the way.
Yeah.
Do you? So, do you watch stuff now? I mean, don't mention a gamer, but do you watch stuff now and think it's still going on?
100%. Yeah.
At all levels.
I won't say at all levels. Where again, we look at the top of the mountain with sport. If you look below the 1%, players don't really earn a lot of money. The women's game now, players are not earning a lot of money, under-resourced, underfunded. Owners are buying clubs across the world to wash illicit funds. Match fixing stems into various different crimes. It's not just match fixing. A lot of where betting and gambling and that addiction is. For example, in America, they have new gambling laws that are under 5 years old. The World Cup is in America, 2028. The LA Games is, 2026, 2028. So a lot of where people are so far behind, we almost live in the UK with a misbelief on the actual culture and influence of
honestly, Moses, is so right on that. The introduction of gambling in American sport over the last 3 years, 4 years maybe, is outside of Vegas where it had been done, I suppose. Now every single broadcast that I feel like I watch with the NFL seems to have odds on it, and it's like this great big new world for the Americans.
Yeah, and what you'll find, because the collegiate and, again, education and foundation is quite different, they're able now, I think there was a new bill that's passed where they're going to pay a lot of the NCAA athletes. Yeah. In the UK, you don't have an alumni network. You get to Palace, for example, at 18, you don't get a professional contract. Majority of players don't play football again. There's a latest case with a player from Arsenal, unfortunately, that's gone to prison for drug offences. Yeah. So how do you go from playing in the Champions League to now be in a position, probably in a country where he may have been induced, or I don't know the ins and outs.
Your situation was slightly unique in the sense that, as you pointed out, it was your last week of year 11. A lot of players come through the academy system at a club from 7 years old, right? And even if they swap academies when they're 8 or 9 and they go somewhere else, you'd like to think, Mark, that along the way, their education to be a footballer involves understanding, the moral compass that they're supposed to, have grown, and understand that this is, against the law. While match fixing, as you say, itself per se isn't. Obviously, you can be done for many other crimes in terms of committing fraud, effectively. So, at the moment, what, as you understand it, is the education of young players all the way through the football pyramid? To
be fair, it's a great question. I was very fortunate enough last year to go to Singapore on behalf of FIFA for Integrity. So I actually got to see 211 member associations and some of the issues they have. In the majority of countries and leagues, there isn't even a safeguarding officer. One person has to do 10 jobs, including integrity. They have to do doping and drugs and awareness and abuse, and a lot of areas where there aren't any actual worldwide experts for what I'm speaking about. So when you're employed by lawyers and top academics, the translation of that language back into the athlete is almost non-existent.
So as you understand it, say top Premier League clubs or the Premier League, is there somebody responsible?
Yeah, I'll say the Premier League is quite unique and different because they have the resource, and now it's changed even with the FA. I remember they had a couple of integrity officers to now they have quite a robust team. A lot of the Cat 1 Premier League teams have the right facilities and people there. However, again, it all comes down to who is actually delivering this education. If you're brought up and born and bred in the heart of Southeast London, what are some of those challenges? And within those challenges, they do have the right people like a Crystal Palace to go and help the players. However, that's just the Premier League. Football's a global game with billions of people watching it as well. So the issues are quite severe. It's actually got worse, to be honest. In
Has
other
it?
areas of the world. Yeah.
Education can only do so much, though, can't it? And this is I suppose this is the depressing thing about it. And it didn't necessarily happen with you, but fear, threats to yourself, threats to your family. These are all issues that young sports people globally, if they get approached to be involved in this, are going to be subject to. And it doesn't matter, does it, how much they may think it's wrong and they've been told it's wrong. If they're in fear of their lives or in fear of their families' lives, you're probably still going to go through with it, aren't you?
You know what? I think to flip back your question on you, education is just the foundation.
Yeah.
One thing you'll find with the future of sport and generations, the generation now are equipped with tablets and phones, and athletes spend much more time on their phones than they do probably playing actual sport. How you can enhance the foundation of education is developing the right tools in order for players and athletes and the community of sport to really understand what it is we're saying. Because whilst you may look at the side of education and it not being sufficient enough, we now have the power of a global community that understands parents and guardians going into sport are much more well equipped in football more than they ever have been. So the change is actually happening, even though it's a smaller change. It's really upstairs and the people.
Is it a bit though like drugs in sport? And I mean performance enhancing drugs. It feels like because those people are criminally motivated, there will always be one step ahead, and it's eradicating this problem as it's $1 trillion industry is nigh on impossible. It has to come from the ability of that individual to say no, or to be able to feel they can call out those approaches.
You know what, it really comes down to what integrity is. I didn't know what that was until I went to prison. What does integrity actually mean? Ethics, values, the core fundamental basis of why sport exists. That isn't really spoken about at the highest level. So before we go into sport from schools and society, are we actually teaching kids and coaches, and more importantly, even the most senior people within these organisations don't actually know what that word means? Whilst money and finance is up here and the business of sport revolves around, we've now missed the opportunity to actually bring in these young kids at 6 and 7 and take them to one-to-one training. But what does that actually mean? There's much more players and people who have actually said no than said we're not going to do this and we're going to report it, than the small few who went and made my decisions. And more importantly, again, if you don't understand what integrity is across the world, it's very difficult to come into any sport or environment or business in the financial industry. It's insider trading. If I now turn around and tell a player, or tell yourself, Gabby, by the way, I've been approached, if you don't report it, you're as good as guilty. Players have reported and still been banned by doing the right things because of that 48-hour window. So the fear, as you mentioned, is incremental to making the right or wrong decisions because no one wants to be labelled a snitch.
Are you optimistic or are you pessimistic about the future? And I have to, me and Gab, before you came into the studio, I just said to Gabby, I looked on, and maybe I'm part of the problem here because I have a bet every now and then. So I have a betting app. So I look at my betting app, Moses, right? And what's in play now. I could bet on a FIFA World Cup qualifier, the Australian Queensland Premier League, Queensland Ladies Australian NPL. There's tennis going on. I could bet on table tennis. I could bet on basketball in the Philippines if I want to. There's a super series going on in dart, Korean baseball. there's there's bloody esports that I mean, I don't even understand what they're competing. FIFA, maybe, I don't know, but there's esports going on. All of those strike me as like anything. They could all be vulnerable, couldn't they?
They could all be, but I won't say you're part of the problem, because at the end of the day, it's really legal and illegal. That's what we're dealing with. The question I'll ask everybody here is, imagine your son or daughter who's under 10, there's live betting markets on their matches. Would you still continue to use betting and gambling knowing that they can potentially be targeted? And I think that's a real question when you're looking at what I'm speaking about, because it only really hits you unless it hits home.
Do you think it's a really uncomfortable truth here, and you've alluded to it there, Mark, that so much of the wealth of top-level sport is built on gambling markets, basically? You know, clubs that have been sponsored and owned by gambling companies, the money that sloshes around at the top, a lot of it is coming from legal gambling, right? I'm not talking about the stuff that you were involved with. And it's an uncomfortable truth, isn't it? That it is all quite, you know, there is a lot of links to stuff that's not very nice at all, and is and is not legal. So, you know, do we really want to dive into it? That's the question, isn't it? And you talk about integrity. Where has sport kind of, you know, left it behind? Has it gone?
I think it's been forgotten, but also I do believe in everything's in moderation. Alcohol, people still take drugs, you know, people still drive with their phones in their hands. So if you take away something that ultimately adds value in the right way, people are aware smoking kills and it may give you cancer, etc., but people still do it within moderation. So again, for me, in my own personal experiences, betting shouldn't really be deemed as bad if it's helping educate and it's letting people know what the dangers are. And a lot of the regulated companies go and do that. The difference in what we're saying, kids are being targeted here. You know, it's grooming, there's vulnerability. It's almost a very subtle, elusive way, because the real greed is addiction and earning money. So you can almost be in a system or environment or industry where the same issues actually happens in various different industries.
Yeah, I mean, you've alluded to it there.
You know, sport is the 9th biggest industry in the world. So when you look at the top 5 or the top 3, and you may understand their problems, sport just has a spotlight on it. However, every single person, in my humble opinion, needs to have much more awareness around the dangers, not only within illegal betting and gambling, and more importantly, with the case that's currently happening now. I can fundamentally tell you if the player...
Do you mean the Lucas Paqueta?
Yeah.
And what are your
with
thoughts
my
on
understanding, it's quite unfortunate, simply because how do you now police your borders? You know, he's come into the UK. There's a high-level organised criminal syndicate or syndicates in Brazil. They've had the worst match-fixing scandal in their history in the last few years. And unfortunately for him, whether that's through family or inside information, if he has taken actions to influence the outcomes of games, I was banned, but I didn't get a lifetime ban, simply because of what I knew and how I wanted to help. And if you make a mistake, don't get me wrong, you should be penalised. But for him to lose his career...
Well, we don't... the case is finished, but the outcome is not known yet.
Yeah, we don't know the outcome, but either or, if he is found guilty or if he isn't...
Him, West Ham have said
we're still dealing with a human being here.
Yeah.
You know, I hold my hands up. If he's done wrong, get his punishment. But if he hasn't done anything wrong, how do we help him? You know, how do we allow more people to not end up in those positions? And the sport has the resource to go and do that. So for me, it's quite peculiar that the right support, from what I know internally, isn't really there, you know.
So difficult, Moses, isn't it? And it's so nuanced. And the more you delve into these kind of subjects, me and Gabby have talked about it before, you know, an 18-year-old Pakistani cricketer back in the day, Mohammed Amir, who was banned for deliberately bowling no balls, and yet he's 18 years old. And again, there were more senior figures there who, to go back to your phrase, had groomed him to do that. I have huge sympathy for the individuals who are targeted in these situations. So do you, as you sit there with us today, you were groomed, you are a victim in this as well, but also do you carry guilt for what you did when you look at those people who were involved in those games who had nothing to do
100.
with it, and whose careers have gone in different directions. You know, I say this, you know, Chris Sutton's a mate, obviously, but you must carry that.
Oh, 100%. You know, it's come in so many different stages over the last... I've had to go through therapy when I was in prison. So for me to understand the severity of the people it's affected, which I never really knew and cared about at that time because I was very much in my own self without realising the dangers. And more importantly, the podcast really allowed me to go back to those people and face ultimately what you said, which is my teammates that were affected, you know, the cooks, everybody that the fans, you know. I sat down with Masha, a diehard Bromley fan in the last 12 years. I remember him screaming out, "This game's rigged," in 2012. So for him to tweet that at that time, and for him to carry the burden of the actions, not only what I was part of and created, that's something I'm going to have to live with for the rest of my life. So if I'm not able to give some form of resistance back to the game and show people that if I can turn my life around and make the right decisions, my core was always going to be who I was. I could have been, you know, a top player with the right resources and everything else, but not everybody has that opportunity. And going to prison and facing ultimately what the game is, which is built on fans. How about my teammates? Players who honestly played within that period that were going on that pitch, giving 100%, were part of a system that was completely rigged. So you was either going to be a part of it or you was going to not be a part of it because of that peer pressure, Gabby. And as you probably know, sport holds you in such a tight-knit foothold. When you're able to be fearless and speak up and make a difference, that's when you become an outlier and start making the right transitions and changes, because a lot of people actually go and do the right things, which is what I want to say. I don't want to sit here and give excuses to my actions. Prison actually saved my life. If I didn't go to prison and I wasn't arrested on that day, I probably won't be sitting here, or I'm lucky to be alive simply because of what I was involved in. So again,
do you feel vulnerable now? Because, you know, you've been to prison, but...
Yeah, you know what's really, really strange here? I don't actually feel vulnerable. If anything, I feel much more empowered. You know, I feel part of this story and journey has allowed other people to come forward. Women's game, football, professional players, amateur players, parents, guardians, literally people I would have never been able to connect to with everything that they're going through. So the community of what the story and the book and the podcast has created has been incremental.
Say your book, Fixed, My Secret Life as a Match Fixer, is out on June the 12th. Yeah. And we've really, I feel, just scratched the surface of your story today.
Yeah, the book is it's going to be quite an awakening. I probably say I don't really get anxious, but simply because of the contents and context to there, it's going to be really gut-wrenching with some of the detail that I've gone into.
So are there people who will be worried about this book?
100%. The right and wrong people will be worried. But again, you know, the truth would set you free. And again, coming back to fear, I can't fear something that's ultimately so pure and it's the truth, you know.
Are you free and safe?
Yeah, I try to walk with God. If I fear anyone, you should fear the man above. So there hasn't been a fearless moment in my life for the right reasons, where I know every opportunity and what I'm doing is pushing forward and making sure people understand what this is and building from that.
Well, best of luck with the book and also your journey to help educate and to spread the word, if you like. I know it transcends football, doesn't it? You're going over to Switzerland today to speak to the...
Yeah, I'm with the Olympic Committee today. To be honest, FIFA have been amazing over the last 5 years with a lot of their international tournaments and the people who now work within the work that we're doing as well. So as I was mentioning earlier to you off the camera, Gabby, is making sure nations are aware of some of the significant issues and how they deal with that. We're not here turning around and telling you what to do, but we're giving you the right resources with the team and the company and the business to form probably some of the best people in the world for what we're speaking about across the whole landscape as well. So that really helps a lot of people.
The Olympic movement, above all, I think, needs its integrity to be protected, doesn't it? Because that is pretty much, you know, what it is built on. So and the sporting values and principles that we hold so dear.
Thank you, Moses. Thank you very much. Well, Moses mentioned the vulnerability, I suppose, of the growing market of women's sport. And next, we will talk to Sonia Twigg, women's sport reporter for The Telegraph, who has done an investigation into women's cricket and gambling.
Well, along the way in our conversation with Moses Swaibu, he talked about how women's sport has become particularly vulnerable. And we're going to bring in Sonia Twigg now from The Telegraph, who recently was the chief reporter for an investigation into a crackdown taking place in women's cricket, and perhaps the inference that women's cricket had become a soft target for corruption, and the findings of that investigation would seem to lead to the conclusion, Sonia, that it had.
Yes, I think it's something that the England Wales Cricket Board in particular are looking at. I think it's just when you look at the fact that this is non-professional cricket, so they're mostly looking at the lower tiers of the women's game, so in particular tier 2, where a lot of matches are streamed globally on YouTube. But
tier 2 being, so give us an example of
so
what tier 2 fixture
tier
would
2 would be, so there's tier 1, which are the fully professional counties, and then tier 2 would be the likes of Gloucestershire, Kent, Northamptonshire, so the ones who don't have fully professional teams but are still taking part in these national cricket competitions.
Still streamed around the world.
And they're still streamed because the counties, so like Middlesex and Gloucestershire, they want to highlight the women's game, so they want to treat it similarly to the men's and show it off, which is right. I don't think that people shouldn't watch women's cricket, but with that audience comes obviously some dangers with it. That was something that I found in the investigation, that alarming numbers of money being bet on some of these matches. I found out since I actually published the article that there was one game early on in the season when £900,000 was put on the Betfair exchange of this cricket match with non-professional players.
On a tier 2 county match in the women's
on
game?
A tier 2 county match.
£900,000.
Coming from how many sources?
This is on the Betfair exchange, so this is just one market, and that just shows these sums that are being bet on some of these fixtures.
And are you able to tell where the majority of those funds are they coming from? The Asian markets?
Well, this is the Betfair exchange, so this is also the legal betting markets, and who knows how much money is being bet on overseas.
Betfair not have to kind of have there's no due diligence working out? Would that, sorry, it just feels like it would ring an alarm bell to me.
Well, I think it has, and I think this is why the ECB have been sending anti-corruption officials, as I mentioned in the piece. They've sent anti-corruption officials to look at, this was something that did set off alarm bells, and it's why they've reacted to it, and they've looked to implement, it's called PMOA, but it's essentially where players don't have access to their phones during matches. They have their own specific area which members of the public aren't allowed into, and it is to try and sort of increase the gap between, because some of these matches take place at, as I'm sure you're aware, like at county outgrounds where normally they're used for club cricket, so people can just wander in a way that you can't at sort of the Oval or Lords.
But those tier 2 county games, and they follow the same rules that the tier 1 women would do, that the men's county game would do, about no access to phones, and honestly, you go to a cricket match, the protocol around changing rooms and dressing rooms and what you need to get in and get out of a dressing room when it comes to passes is incredibly strict, Sonia, isn't it? So does tier 2 follow that?
Tier 2 doesn't have to follow that unless they're playing a tier 1 side. Tier 2, because if you're putting on a ground, some of these matches have taken place in places like Brecon. The feasibility of putting on PMOA with security for some of these counties is more difficult. And so some of them have the PMOA restrictions in place for the double headers with the men's game and for any match against a tier 1 side. But for some of the tier 2 matches, no, they aren't in place.
There was just to go back to those stats, and you mentioned that 900,000 for that tier 2 game. I have a stat in front of me as well, which will have come from your investigation, that in a women's quarter-final between Kent and the Blaze, that nearly £300,000 was placed on that via the Betfair exchange and watched by nearly 80,000 people on YouTube. To contrast that, the 9 men's county fixtures that day had a total of £8,500 bet on them. That's all of those 9 compared to that one game.
Okay, so the alarm bells are definitely ringing at this point, right? And so what's the reaction then from the ECB?
I think the reaction is to try and increase the number of matches that have this PMOA in place, and encourage players to hand in their phones. We found that players have been contacted on social media by people overseas trying to get team information and who's going to play and who's going to not play. So I think it's just a real crackdown on that and increased.
Have players spoken to you about being approached for more than that?
They haven't, but I don't also think they would. I don't think at the moment there's any suggestion that there has been match fixing in place. I think it's more concerned about the betting side of things. And I know that at one game they have actually, again, this was since I wrote the
betting side
article.
of things is linked to match fixing.
Of course it is. But from what I found anyway, and there was a match where they did kick out 2 courtsiders from one of these outgrounds as well.
For what? For
illegally relaying information from that match overseas.
How were they doing that then? They were just texting?
With just because of the delay
right.
in sending information, if you're there and
How long are we talking about for that delay?
I mean, it doesn't have to be long, but the thing with cricket
seconds.
is a cricket market, you can bet on so many different things. So if you bet on a catch, you send that information, you bet on someone to get out, they then do it, you send that information quicker than
the coverage is going to be. So you've got to be in really quickly, obviously. In that.
Obviously, but you also have to be there.
Yes.
So this was what one of the things they're looking at.
And in February, the first female player was banned for corruption by the ICC. Tell us a little bit more about that story.
So it was related to something this Bangladeshi player, Shaheli Akhtar, did during the 2023 Women's World Cup, where she encouraged one of her players and tried to bribe one of her fellow players to get out, hit wicket, which is a particular dismissal, and offered her 2 million tadkas, which I think is about £12,000, to do this. And the player didn't and reported it immediately. And yes, in February this year, she was banned from.
Is there when we spoke to Moses before, we talked about the vulnerability that the players, or how vulnerable players are and how they are at the mercy of these organisations. Do you think that's even more the case in women's cricket globally?
I think so, just because a lot of people in women's cricket globally are still fighting to have a living in the sport. I mean, in this country, we're really lucky. There are over 100 professionals, but that's just not the case everywhere. And I think that's why my investigation focused on Tier 2, which is the non-professional side of the women's game, because that is sort of more vulnerable in a way than those who are risking professional livelihoods.
So the inference from what you've said at the moment is on those Tier 2 games, it's people at the grounds sending information to those markets somewhere else in the world, rather than the players themselves being as vulnerable. From talking to Moses, perhaps we're naive to think that isn't, going on, and that those sports are, women's sports generally, are perhaps more vulnerable than we might think to that individual.
I think so. I think it's also partly because of social media. Anyone in the world can contact these people in a way that probably wasn't.
It doesn't need to be a teammate. It doesn't.
No, it doesn't. I mean, these things weren't possible sort of 10, 15 years ago. You couldn't just pick up your phone and send a message to someone in a completely different country and try and influence it. But you can now. And I think that's something that people need to be aware of. And I think that's why they are putting in sort of more education programs and things, just to try and encourage people and awareness. I mean, people might not realise that telling their friend's cousin who's going to play in a few days actually could have betting implications, or therefore spot fixing implications.
Yeah. We've often talked actually about the difference in certain sports and announcing teams. Like rugby doesn't seem to care and announces its team 2 days before an international, whereas football sticks to its kind of hour 15 minutes before every match, pretty much. What's the norm in cricket, and does Tier 2 change, or is it different?
Cricket is very hit and miss. You will have cricket captains like Ben Stokes, for example, who will happily say 2 days before a game who's going to play and who's not, and others who will be militant and only announce who's going to play at the toss, which is half an hour before the start.
that needs to be regulated, does it not? That everybody announces a team at the same time, because that's immediately an unfair advantage, isn't it, if you're looking at the markets?
I think it's difficult to say. I think it depends whether you can bet on it or have influence on it, and who's going to play. I think it's difficult to tell a captain that they can't tell their team in advance, and others how they have to do it. I think potentially for the shorter formats of cricket, which are the ones that are most susceptible to these markets, I think there are things that could potentially be put in place, but it's really difficult to say when cricket's it's a unique sport that's full of these sort of slightly quirky traditions that a lot of the time you don't really want to change.
It's so difficult to do that, isn't it, Sonia? Because there'll be some captains who will look up at the sky and decide to change the makeup of their team,
that morning
at the toss, or look down at the pitch and decide to change it. If you're the visiting team, you may not. And given how much cricket there is and how much travelling there is, you may only turn up on the morning of a game and not even have a chance to have a look at what you're about to play on. So to sort of name a team 2 days in advance, I would imagine for visiting teams is actually very hard.
And also just because, the weather might change so quickly in cricket, and you might have been predicted for sunshine and think you're going to bat, and then suddenly it's grey, cloudy, and you're contemplating a completely different decision, and that might play into what team you choose as well. I think cricket's just such a sort of unique sport with so many variables in that sense.
So the ECB is on a mission to obviously increase the education for players generally, and as you mentioned, the phones and that kind of contact with the public, if you like, in the actual matches. And also being vigilant as to kind of, people sitting there texting ferociously throughout a cricket match would look slightly suspicious.
Well, it would, but then also if there's a stadium where you've got 3,000 or 4,000 people, it must be quite difficult to find these people sort of furiously texting.
I was telling the guys earlier, chappers, about being at Wimbledon in centre court last year and watching a guy with 2 phones just texting the whole time, the match that I was watching on centre court, and I could see in plain sight what he was doing. He was clearly a professional gambler, and he just was sat on centre court.
Well, I think that's why the game where they have the ground where they have kicked out to courtsiders is because it is an outground, so it's a lot easier to notice than if you're playing at the Oval with 28,000 people. I mean, how are you going to find one person with 2 phones?
Yeah.
But then I suppose at the same time, you can walk in free to some of these outgrounds, can't you? So actually getting in is probably easier to get in than the Oval, but harder to hide.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some of the games are also public cricket clubs. A lot of them have, people come and they'll walk their dogs around a few times and they'll take them out, and there's no monitoring of who's there and who's not, and that's the case for all cricket matches at outgrounds, really. A lot of them are free to entry because they want to encourage people to come and watch, because this isn't the Oval.
No,
there aren't huge sort of stadiums and seats filled with fans, so I think it's a difficult balancing act, but I think it's also just drawing awareness to it and making people aware of the reality, and players aware of the reality and the danger. And you might think it's a harmless message to say, I'm not playing on Sunday, but just think who you're telling that information to.
Well, you are on your way to a very much an all-ticketed event, I understand. You're going to Queen's for the women's event, the first women's event at Queen's for the first time in 52 years, and the new Sir Andy Murray stand. Are you going there today? Are you in the stand?
Yes. Yeah. I was mixing between Court 1 and the main arena yesterday, but I think I'll be on the main arena today.
And is Balticanu, are they in action today?
They're not. They're individually in action today.
Right, okay.
They're combined. I think their next doubles match is tomorrow.
Okay. Well, excitement, no
doubt.
Why
do we have to put players' names together on everything?
It started with J-Lo. Sorry.
It did.
Yeah.
No,
not J-Lo. It started with. Sorry, no, it didn't. It started with Brangelina. Did it not?
Oh yes, I suppose it did actually.
Brangelina.
Yeah. I was thinking it started with Fleetwood and Molinari because they became Mollywood, didn't they? I think at that right.
They
did.
But Balticanu doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
No, neither does Chaperogan, but that's what you call us. So. Thank you so much, Sonia, for coming in and telling us about your investigation, and enjoy Queen's.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me.
Well, that's it for this pod. Genuinely love to hear your thoughts on what we've heard from our guests today. the email is thesportsagents@global.com, or you can get in touch on our socials, because as we both said many times during those chats and have said before, Gabby, this is such a nuanced, complicated world.
Yeah, and I shouldn't probably say this because we just asked you to listen for the last hour or so, but it feels like you're literally not even scratching your fingertips, just kind of just stroking the top of something that is mired in organised crime, is globally moving money around the world, and at the top of that are these people who are very vulnerable, who are being used to to carry the can effectively for this kind of stuff, and I don't know what sport does. And that's the unsatisfactory feeling.
It massively. The depressing part of it, I think, when we get to the end of it, and I'm sure you're listening thinking the same thing, is what do we do? How on earth can this kind of thing be prevented? And if we're saying that it can't, how much of what we watch do we have to doubt? And that's when it really gets miserable.
Well, on that cheery note, catch up with all our episodes on Global Player or wherever you get your podcasts. Remember to hit subscribe or follow, and we'll be back with something hopefully to raise your spirits on Thursday.
I tell you, Thursday is going to be fun. We're at Soccer Aid. It will be fun. Completely different. Put a smile on your face.
The Sports Agents
with Gabby Logan and Mark Chapman.